I thought that a good way to start today's chapter would be with a joke, since we're living some pretty heavy times. Maybe a little lightheartedness is the way to go. So here goes. Why do the French have only one egg for breakfast? Because an egg is enough. Little ambiance. I know it's been a rough couple of days for sure, but that's just the way it goes. I thought that lighting some incense would be nice, set a little mood, but it's quite smelly. Fortunately, I have this very high-tech device. This will definitely protect against that overwhelming incense. You get the gist of it. I mean, I want to tie it above my head, but I'm not very experienced with this kind of thing, so as if it wasn't even there. Amazing. Just, I guess I'll save the coffee for later. So yeah, to mask or not to mask? That is the question, or that has been the question. But anyway, so how does this relate to what I want to read today? So I had this specific book in mind, which is a collection by an author that kind of enjoyed a lot back in the day, Douglas Hofstadter. And with this other guy, I mean, they're pretty much partners in crime, Daniel C. Dennett. This collection called The Mind's Eye. It says Fantasies and Reflections on Self and Soul, but it really is a book about circling around the concepts of artificial intelligence. In this book, I was happy to come across that there's an excerpt from The Selfish Gene, and so I said, okay, I'll just reread it. It made me remember how great a writer Richard Dawkins is in the sense of presenting scientific concepts and leading you to reframe the way you understand things, which is a very important point. So picture this. You wake up a day that is not like any other day you've lived before, say today. You open your computer, you go to the Facebook, and you're bombarded by what? By memes. And there's nothing like a good meme. I mean, we can all enjoy a good meme. I mean, the person who doesn't enjoy a good meme, I pity you. Nowadays, it's very easy to look things up. So it's not like, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. To really learn something, there had to be this very strong drive to delve into something, do research, get books. A very different landscape. Now we're in the very kind of instantaneous information era, which is great, but it's also bad. Okay, so I have this tendency to speak in these weird parables where I start to make a point and then I'll throw in another anecdote and I'll veer off course, and sometimes I'll forget where I was going. But I was talking about memes. I think very few people have actually stopped or paused to see where the term comes from. When I first heard the term meme in its internet usage, I remember being quite intrigued, and I didn't really understand what it was. I mean, this was long time ago. Now it's kind of like a self-evident thing. Everybody pretty much knows what a meme is, except maybe like our grandparents. I don't have any grandparents left, so I don't know if they would know or not. Yeah, so it's this little picture with this little text, and it's kind of funny, and everybody's just posting them, and they get them from some factory somewhere in China, I guess. But the reason why I was very confused when this first came up, when people were saying memes, was that I had first encountered that term, and I think he's the actual creator of the term. It's Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene. He basically proposed this alternative to a gene, and that's why he called it meme, because it kind of rhymed. I mean, it's kind of a silly name. And then I guess, I don't know if the internet took it from him. I'm assuming yes, at some point. And then it became this thing. And most people just use the term, oh, the memes, but never really think about the meaning of the term itself, and then think of it in connection to what Richard Dawkins constructed in his book, The Selfish Gene. Okay, so should you wear a mask? Should you not wear a mask? That is the question, I guess. I wanted to talk about artificial intelligence, but this led me to Richard Dawkins and The Selfish Gene. And the word selfish, which is a word I think that we're reflecting upon a lot in these times. So I guess this whole mask question, the problem was that we started from the very selfish, and I mean it's normal for it to be this way, from the very selfish position of, oh, can I protect myself by wearing a mask? And this really informed the way the question was being asked and answered. And I think just until this weekend, enough information came out that kind of underlined the fact that we were asking the question in the wrong way, I guess. So the question was not, should I wear a mask to protect myself, but it's should I wear a mask to protect others, which is not the natural way we would proceed into asking this question. So by reframing the question this way, at least for now, it seems that we can say, oh yeah, we should all wear masks, and it doesn't have to be, we don't have to panic and purchase like these masks online, which are very much needed elsewhere. We could just do a little thingy like this. I mean, I would tend to put a bit more layers on this, but it's just assuming that you were carrying the virus and being one of the asymptomatic cases, that you limit the spread. And so all of a sudden, just reframing that simple question, it leads us, I think, to very important information, at least at this point. We need to take everything we hear with a grain of salt. Information can change from one day to the other. We don't know that much yet, and we will not know for a while. But right now we're just so desperate to know something, to feel that we regain control of the situation, that we'll just jump on anything. Confirmation bias is a bitch right now. So we need to find a way to keep our critical spirit going somehow. But anyway, so Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene. I think what he does so brilliantly in this book, at least what I recalled him doing, is kind of reframing the question of evolution. I think the way we speak of evolution, trivially, but like even in schools, it's like, oh, these creatures evolved to adapt to this environment or whatnot. And this kind of affects something in our brains. We start seeing things in a way that is kind of related to the way things are, but it actually is not. So we think of evolution as this kind of proactive way of adapting, like there's a problem to be solved and evolution solves it. And yes, this happens in a way, but it is more by accident and not by intent. But there's some nuance there too, and I'm pretty bad at explaining it here just because I didn't script this. I'm just like winging it. But I thought I could read selfish genes and selfish memes. Selfish genes. In the beginning, I'm having trouble seeing. Maybe I'll wear my glasses, sorry. In the beginning was simplicity. It is difficult enough explaining how even a simple universe began. I take it as agreed that it would be even harder to explain the sudden springing up fully armed of complex order. Life, or a being capable of creating life. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is satisfying because it shows us a way in which simplicity could change into complexity, how unordered atoms could group themselves into ever more complex patterns until they ended up manufacturing people. Darwin provides a solution, the only feasible one so far suggested, to the deep problem of our existence. I will try to explain the great theory in a more general way than is customary, beginning with the time before evolution itself began. Darwin's survival of the fittest is really a special case of a more general law of survival of the stable. The universe is populated by stable things. A stable thing is a collection of atoms which is permanent enough or common enough to deserve a name. It may be a unique collection of atoms, such as the Matterhorn, which last long enough to be worth naming, or it may be a class of entities, such as raindrops, which come into existence at sufficiently high rate to deserve a collective name, even if any one of them is short-lived. The things which we see around us, in which we think of as needing explanation, rocks, galaxies, ocean waves, are all, to the greater or lesser extent, stable patterns of atoms. Soap bubbles tend to be spherical because this is the stable configuration. Okay, I was just bullshitting with these glasses. It's actually a lot harder to read with them because they're super scratched. But on Earth, where there is gravity, the stable surface for standing water is flat and horizontal. In the Sun, the simplest atoms of all, hydrogen atoms, are fusing to form helium atoms because in the conditions which prevail there, the helium configuration is more stable. The point that is relevant here is that, before the coming of life on Earth, some rudimentary evolution of molecules could have occurred by ordinary processes of physics and chemistry. There is no need to think of design or purpose or directedness. If a group of atoms in the presence of energy falls into a stable pattern, it will tend to stay that way. The earliest form of natural selection was simply a selection of stable forms and a rejection of unstable ones. There is no mystery about this. It had to happen by definition. From this, of course, it does not follow that you can explain the existence of entities as complex as man by exactly the same principles on their own. It is no good taking the right number of atoms and shaking them together with some external energy till they happen to fall into the right pattern, and out drops atom. You may make a molecule consisting of a few dozen atoms like that, but a man consists of over 1,000 million atoms. To try to make a man, you would have to work at your biochemical cocktail shaker for a period so long that the entire age of the universe would seem like an eye blink, and even then, you would not succeed. This is where Darwin's theory, in its most general form, comes to the rescue. Darwin's theory takes over from where the story of the slow building up of molecules leaves off. The account of the origin of life, which I shall give, is necessarily speculative. By definition, nobody was around to see what happened. There are a number of rival theories, but they all have certain features in common. The simplified account I shall give is probably not too far from the truth. We do not know what chemical raw materials were abundant on Earth before the coming of life, but among the plausible possibilities there are water, carbon dioxide, methane, and ammonia, all simple compounds known to be present on at least some of the other planets in our solar system. At some point, a particularly remarkable molecule was formed by accident. We will call it the replicator. It may not necessarily have been the biggest or the most complex molecule around, but it had the extraordinary property of being able to create copies of itself. So we seem to arrive at a large population of identical replicas. But now we must mention an important property of any copying process. It is not perfect. Mistakes will happen. I hope there are no misprints in this book, but if you look carefully, you may find one or two. They will probably not seriously distort the meaning of the sentences, because they will be first-generation errors. But imagine the days before printing, when books such as the Gospels were copied by hand. All scribes, however careful, are bound to make a few errors, and some are not above a little willful improvement. If they all copied from a single master original, meaning would not be greatly perverted. But let copies be made from other copies, which in their turn were made from other copies, and errors will start to become cumulative and serious. We tend to regard erratic copying as a bad thing, and in the case of human documents, it is hard to think of examples where errors can be described as improvements. I suppose the scholars of the Septuagint could at least be said to have started something big when they mistranslated the Hebrew word for young woman into the Greek word for virgin, coming up with a prophecy: "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son." Anyway, as we shall see, erratic copying in biological replicators can in a real sense give rise to improvement. And it was essential for the progressive evolution of life that some errors were made. We do not know how accurately the original replicator molecules made their copies. Their modern descendants, the DNA molecules, are astonishingly faithful compared with the most high-fidelity human copying process. But even they occasionally make mistakes, and it is ultimately these mistakes which make evolution possible. Probably, the original replicators were far more erratic, but in any case, we may be sure that mistakes were made, and these mistakes were cumulative. If you already know something about evolution, you may find something slightly paradoxical about the last point. Can we reconcile the idea that copying errors are an essential prerequisite for evolution to occur with the statement that natural selection favors high copying fidelity? The answer is that, although evolution may seem, in some vague sense, a good thing, especially since we are the product of it, nothing actually wants to evolve. Evolution is something that happens willy-nilly. In spite of all the efforts of the replicators, and nowadays of the genes, to prevent it happening, Jacques Monod made this point very well in his Herbert Spencer lecture after wryly remarking, "Another curious aspect of the theory of evolution is that everybody thinks he understands it." To return to the primeval soup, it must have become populated by stable varieties of molecule, stable in that either the individual molecules lasted a long time, or they replicated rapidly, or they replicated accurately. Evolutionary trends towards these three kinds of stability took place in the following sense. If you had sampled the soup at two different times, the later sample would have contained a higher proportion of varieties with high longevity, fecundity, copying fidelity. This is essentially what a biologist means by evolution when he is speaking of living creatures, and the mechanism is the same: natural selection. So we go from this concept of living creatures want to evolve, as evolution being this kind of process of proactive adaptation, whereas it is more a case of errors in copying that can lead to more stable forms of reproduction. But if all the surrounding conditions favor this thing remaining in this stable form, this form will take over. And the thing that is so hard for us to grasp is that this is taking place over millions of years. It is very hard for us to see this from our human perspective of time, broken down into minutes, hours, days, months. In the current situation, it's such a fast compression of survival, basically. I think it allows us to potentially, like if we can set our hysterics and panic aside, it allows us to reframe a lot of things that we had previously not been able to understand. It's just basically like a biological imperative, and Dawkins later challenges this with the idea of the meme specifically. From a DNA standpoint, from a genetic reproductive standpoint, things want to remain stable. And it is partially a mistake, but it is partially accurate when we transpose this concept to the way we behave. So what does that imply in a time such as this, where there's great change, a huge potential threat to health, to infrastructure, but we want to remain stable? I think this juxtaposition can really help us understand a lot of our behaviors. It won't necessarily give us the answer to these things, because there's so many variables and variants that we just cannot yet predict these things exactly. And I mean, what was it, 1 or 2 weeks ago when we had the mad toilet paper dashes of people just kind of panicking, trying to hoard everything they could, just kind of overbuying, not thinking of other people but just of themselves. And we're like, okay, put this into perspective, there are better ways to go about this. And now we see this at a much larger level with medical supplies at the level of governments. A certain government, I'm not going to name names, trying to undercut others and is competing for those finite resources in what could be deemed a selfish way, rather than trying to come up with a global solution, as this is a global pandemic. Yeah, I don't want to point fingers specifically, because I think it's just a very kind of basic human thing to do. But fortunately, we have the ability to go beyond this. It's not easy, and we don't always succeed. In fact, we very rarely succeed. But the great thing is that one small success on the side of empathy, humanity, that manages to make its way into our structures of governance and society can have huge, meaningful impacts as well. And I think this is a very good way to tie into the concept of meme that I guess I'll leave for next chapter, just because it was taking a bit longer, I guess, than I thought it would to get through this. But I hope you can see how some of these concepts relate to what I was babbling about before I started. Back in the day when I was doing my bachelor's a long time ago in humanities, what a surprise, I had actually started out in physics, and then I wanted to switch to biology, and I did that for a year, but I was very disenchanted. I had a very romanticized vision of what it meant to be a physicist, a scientist. The reality, at least at the university where I was studying, was definitely not that. It was very utilitarian people and people who actually wanted to get into other disciplines but were maybe doing this just for some time. So that there was not this highly cultured, curious landscape of people from which you could feed off, and that ended causing me to veer off, I guess, into the humanities, and with a focus more on literature and philosophy of all things, and then cinema. As you can see, I'm quite skilled in the cinematic. I mean, this is no accident.